Hi, everybody. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 13, The Sun Also Rises. So, in Chapter 13, we get this celebration of different friendships, different emotional connections, specifically between the different male characters, most notably in this chapter, Jake, Bill, and this new guy, the Englishman Harris, who they meet while they are fishing. On top of that, as we've seen previously through the book, Hemingway uh, really seeks to highlight and emphasize the special nature of the kinds of relationships that exist between combat veterans. And really, Harris in particular in this chapter is used to make that point. You know, there's a certain fraternity amongst them, there's a certain bonding amongst them, right? That they understand what it was like while others don't. And it all kind of traces back to that sort of foxhole mentality coming out of World War One. And I know I've mentioned this before, and even before remote learning began, we mentioned this about how you really only had the other men in your troop, your platoon, or whatever the case might be. And bravery and courage really didn't matter a whole lot in the face of a machine gun or mortar fire or something along those. You really relied on luck and you relied on each other to kind of get through that. And so as a result, there's a special bond between these people. And Jake, Bill, and now Harris certainly exemplify that. Um, we see Harris telling Jake and Bill during their time together that life really post-war was really kind of hard for him. And he does that right before giving them this gift of the handmade fishing flies. If anybody's familiar with fly fishing, but the little lures, if you will, they call flies at the end, those have to be, handmade and hand tied, and then put on the hook on the end of the line. It's a time consuming process, um, and it's really emblematic of the appreciation that Harris has for Jake and Bill and the conversations that they can have. And so I think a lot of what Hemingway is trying to express here is that there can be this kind of emotional intimacy between men, and in a lot of ways it's even encouraged. But there's a catch, there's a caveat to it. It's got to happen under certain circumstances. It has to happen through sports, whether it's bullfighting, tennis, whatever the other sports mentioned in the novel, boxing, um, or through something like war, through that sort of armed conflict. Additionally, in this chapter, we really get hit with this idea of insiders versus outsiders. Now, this is something that's been sort of on the periphery throughout the novel, but in chapter 13, it really becomes sort of front and center. And it begins with Jake talking about the innkeeper Montoya and their sort of connection over bullfighting. He always smiled as though bullfighting were a very special secret between the two of us, a rather shocking, but really a very deep secret that we knew about. He always smiled as though there was something lewd about the secret to outsiders, but that it was something that we understood. So, really, if we think back in hindsight, and certainly if we look at chapter 13, we've got this constant sort of battle between those on the inside who know the truth and those on the outside who are ignorant, whether it's aficionados, as Jay calls them, versus the others who lack that sort of passion, whether it's passion about bullfighting like him and Montoya, or even whether it comes to food and alcohol, the eating and the drinking and all of that, that all falls under that sort of aficionados versus the others category. Earlier, we saw Catholics versus non Catholics. And of course, sort of ongoing is this idea of those who live life versus those who read about it, that whole, Hemingway hero sort of motif. Now, I think it's important to understand and important to realize that in all the different circumstances where we have insiders and outsiders, Jake is the one who is on the inside. There are others like Brett, Bill, and Mike who sort of are half and half. In some of these cases, they're very much insiders, but on other ones, they are definitely the outsiders. And I think a couple of good examples come from Mike and Bill. Mike is an insider when it comes to being a veteran. He was part of World War II, or World War One, excuse me. But clearly, right, cannot hold his liquor. Right, he's constantly drunk in many of the scenes where we see him, including this chapter, and it's a stark difference between him and the other characters who are drinking just as much. Bill is also an experienced fisherman, a sportsman, if you will, but in this particular case, knows really nothing at all about bullfighting. So while he's on the inside when it comes to fishing with Jake, he's definitely on the outside when it comes to bullfighting. And then we have Robert, who is purposefully on the outside of everything, right? He isn't a part of any of it. And there's an interesting part in chapter 13 where a drunk Mike is really sort of berating Robert, um, calling him a steer, which we'll talk about in a minute. But at one point he says, "Why aren't you drunk? Why don't you ever get drunk, Robert?" And it's an important thing to notice, an important thing to realize and sort of think about why that isn't the case. And really, it's sort of this interesting equation. He doesn't need to be drunk because, well, he hasn't suffered the kinds of wounds that these people have. That in some cases, Brett, Bill, Mike, Jake, particular, right, haven't suffered. And he hasn't been wounded because he really hasn't truly lived. And so, there's sort of that correlation, that sort of if A, then B, then B, then C, then A and C, right? Sort of that. I don't know if anybody remembers logic from math, or if they still teach that in math class. Um, but this idea is Cone doesn't behave like them because he truly hasn't lived like them. He hasn't experienced like them. He is on the outside. I mentioned the steers and Mike, calling Robert a steer. Well, for those of you that are unaware, right, a steer is a castrated bull, right? And the steers are used when it comes to bullfighting, when it comes to corralling the bulls to attempt to sort of settle them down. Now, as a result, and we see that in the chapter, right, one of them is gored, one of them is viciously attacked by one of the ultra aggressive bulls. And at one point, Mike says, "I would have thought you'd love being a steer, Robert." And of course, he's mocking him. He's trying to insult Cone. He's trying to cast him as an outsider. And the funny thing is, and sort of the ironic thing is in this case, is that Jake is the one who is obviously right the most similar to the steer, and so it does present some interesting questions for us. Does Jake fulfill that role? Does he sort of calm down the others and sort of bring them back to the herd like we see the steers do? Is he the one? Is he gored by the other aggressive characters? Is he damaged by them? Um, and really, who are those bulls? Who are those aggressive characters? Now, obviously, bulls are male, so Mike and Bill probably fall under that category. But I think even we can put Brett into that category with bull as well. She exhibits a lot of the same behavior. She's sort of androgynous in that way. Her courage is not in question. She was also a veteran of the war as well, so she falls into that realm. And so certainly she can kind of, I think, fall into that umbrella of the bulls. And she certainly is aggressive in the way some of the other characters are. And then so going forward, the question will be, who else can we put in that category, and how does that influence the actions of the others, specifically Jake and Robert? Finally, we get this interesting note at the very end of the chapter when Jake tells us it was like certain dinners I remember from the war. There was much wine and ignored tension and a feeling of things coming that you could not prevent happening. So clearly, here, Jake, relying on his experience from combat, implying that something is lurking in the future. There is some kind of conflict for this little group. What it is at that point remains to be seen, but clearly Hemingway is trying to foreshadow something for us upcoming, right? And using Jake's experience as a war veteran to do that. That's it for chapter 13. Please let me know if you have any questions or concerns. You can always email me, reach out through Google Classroom, or log in to our online office hours from 10 to noon, Monday through Friday.